Section number 61 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jacqueline Burrell Walton. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Chaney Spell. An interview with Chaney Spell, 101 years old. Cantina Heights, Wilson, North Carolina. I really don't know who my first master was. Case I has been sold and hired so much since then. I reckon that I was born in New Hanover, Beaufort County, and I was sold first time in my mammy's arms. We was sold to a man in Cataract County, and from there the speculators took me to Franklin County. I was sold to Mr. McKee, and that's the first thing that I remembers. I don't remember anything about Ma, except that they called her Sal and that she died years and years ago. I reckon that I once had a pappy, but I ain't never seed him. Master McKee was mean to us, and we ain't had nothing to eat nor wear half of the time. We was beat for every little thing. He owned, I reckon, 200 or 300 slaves, and he had 4 overseers. The overseers was mean, and they often beat slaves to death. I worked in the house, sometime round the table, but I ain't got so much to eat. When word come that we was to be sold, I was glad as I could be. They told me that the master has gambled away his money and lost everything but a few slaves. Later, I learned that he had lost me to a Mr. Hartman in Nash County. Marsh Sid Hartman was good as he could be. Sometimes his overseers wasn't, but when he found it out, he let them go. Marsh Sid ain't got but one weakness, and that am pretty yaller gals. He just can't desist them at all. Finally, Miss Mary found it out, and it pretty near broke her heart. The old Marster Sid's daddy, said that as long as he could ride a horse, he could look out for the plantation. So Marsh Sid took Miss Mary to the mountains. Soon after they went away, the war broke, and old Marster was right busy. Not that the slaves ain't stuck to him, but the Yankees won't let them stick. When Marsh Sid and Miss Mary come home, the war was closing and they had lost their slaves. The slaves still loves them, do, and they goes over and cleans house and fixes for the young folks. Out of the war, I married Lug Spell, and we had 5 childrens. He's been dead these many years, and I's worked and worked to raise the childrens. I has been on a charity a long time now, a long time. End of section 61.
Section number 62 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. A Slavery Family. An interview with Tanner Sykes, 77 years of age, of 43 Bragg Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. My mammy had 15 children, which was all born on Dr. Fab Haywood's plantation here in Wake County. My mammy belonged to him, but my daddy belonged to a Mr. Wiggins in Pasquotank County. I think that Dr. Haywood bought him just before the war. Anyhow, we took the name of Wiggins. Mammy's name was Lucinda, and Pappy's name was Osborne. I don't remember seeing many Yankees on Dr. Haywood's place. I don't reckon many come there. Anyhow, we had a guard. I remembers a corn shucking what happened before the war was over, and what a time them niggers did have. They kisses when they find a red year, and after that they pops some popcorn, and they dances to the music of the banjo which Uncle Jed was a-playin'. They dances all night, the best I can remember. I seen a few Yankees, but they was just looking for something to eat. We ain't know nothing about freedom, but the Yankees told us that we ought to be free. They said that we ought to have meat and stuff in the smokehouse. My mammy says that they ain't got good sense, and she tells master what they said. The Yankees has done took all the rations, so there ain't nothing left for the niggers to take. But mammy tells Master Haywood what they says anyhow. Master Haywood says that if he catch any niggers in his smokehouse, that he'll skin 'em alive. He also says that we ain't free, and that we ain't never gonna be free. The next year after the war was a hard year. We ain't had nothing to eat but hard tack and lasses, and sometimes not half enough of that. My pappy still farmed for Master Haywood, but it ain't as good as it is in slavery days. Several years after that, while we was living on Davy Street, I met Frank Sykes and I married him. I can't tell you much about our love-making 'cause it wasn't much, but he always called me Honey Gal, and he asked me to marry him in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He just put his arms around me and he said, "I wants to marry you, Honey Gal." Well, we gets married by the Baptist preacher in Raleigh 50-odd years ago, and we lives together till this past March when he dies. Other boys come to see me, but I ain't loved none of them but Frank. He ain't never whooped me but once, and that was for sassing him, and I reckon that I needed that. We had 5 children, and I stand with my daughter since he died, but I misses him. Yes, ma'am, I misses him pretty awful. End of section number 62, read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, August the 30th, 2021.
Section 63 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2, August 6, 1937. Annie Stephenson, 80 years old, 1813 Rosewood Avenue, Richmond, Virginia. Now at 717 Saunders Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I was born in Hillsborough, North Carolina. I belonged to Charles Holman, and my missus was named Rachel. He owned a plantation near Hillsborough. It was a mighty big plantation in Orange County, and he had a good many slaves on that place. We had tolerable good food, and log cabins and clothes that you wove in the loom, home wove cloth. We had no feather bed. We did not know nothing about feather beds. Slaves like that had bunks, and some slept on the floor. We went barefooted most of the time. Slave shoes had wooden bottoms on 'em. Chillens was not give shoes at our place till they was big enough to work. I remember seeing the Yankees. They wore blue clothes and had brass buttons on 'em. The only work I done was to sweep yards and nurse small chillens. I done very little heavy work. My mother was named Nicey Oldman, and she worked in the field. My father was named Billy Briggs, because he belonged to the Briggs family. I do not remember seeing my father but one time. I never seen a slave sold or whooped, but I heard tell of it. My mother told me about master working so severe. We had a rough boss. He had 2 colored foremen. They were slaves who longed to master. There was no patches allowed to any of the slaves, and none of them had any money. We was not allowed to have any prayer meetings. Mother said she never knowed one on the plantation. There was a lot of talk about the patrollers, but Marster done his own sneaking round. He done a lot of eavesdropping. My mother said when they thought he was asleep, he was awake. He was strict on his slaves, and I didn't know what church was. No books of any kind was allowed to slaves, and I can't read and write. They give 2 days Christmas. Mother said that had always been Marster's rule. I remember the corn shuckings. They lasted 2 or 3 days. There was enough slaves to shuck the corn. They had plenty of cider at corn shuckings and a lot better things to eat than at other times. Marster made corn, peas, and tobacco on the farm, mostly corn. They had plenty hogs, and that was a time when they killed 'em, drying up the fat for lard, trimming and salting the meat and chitlins. The hog guts was called chitlins. Slaves was allowed to eat meats as long as the hogs was gutted. They was allowed to boil some lean parts of the meat and eat it at the killings. We played base and hide and jumping when I was a child. When we got right smart sick, we had a doctor. When we was not mighty sick, we took tea made of catnip, sassafras, and roots. Yes, I remember when they told us we was free. Mother got up the chillins to leave. She got just a few clothes. I remember seeing my uncle come to the house and put up the horse. He put him in the stable, and we all left together. We went to my uncle about 5 miles away on his master's plantation. His master was named Harvey Roundtree. We stayed there 3 weeks, then we went to a white man's place, Bill Gates. We stayed there several years. Mother had 6 children. 3 was bound out for their victuals and clothes, and 3 was with her. We came to White County when I was fully grown. We come in a covered wagon. I saw father one time to remember him. He died before the war closed, and mother never married again. We went to Mr. Jeff Upchurch of White County and worked on his farm. We stayed there 10 or 12 years, and I married while we was there. I married Albert Stephenson. We stayed right on there about 6 years after we married. We then went to Mr. Lonnie Stevens' place, the man who once owned my husband's father. We stayed there 2 years working as day hands. Then we rented a farm from Mr. Joe Smith. This was the first time any of us had ever farmed for ourselves. We kept it up until old age made us unable to farm, and all the children had got grown and left us. We had 13 children, and 6 is living yet. My husband died 2 years ago, this coming August. Slavery, from what I knows and what's been told me, was a mighty bad thing. Don't see how some of the slaves stood it. I never did mind work, but I is unable to work now. I has got a good will, but I is worn out. The only way I lives is by going round among my people. I have no home of my own. End of section 63.
Section 64 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Sam T. Stewart. My name is Sam T. Stewart. I was born in Wake County, North Carolina, December 11th, 1853. My father was a slave, A. H. Stewart, belonging to James R. Stewart, a slave owner whose plantation was in Wake County, near what is now the Harnett County line of southern Wake. Therese was my mother's name. James R. Stewart, a preacher, raised my father, but my mother was raised by Lorenzo Franks, a Quaker in Wake County. When I was 2 years old, James R. Stewart sold my father to speculators, and he was shipped to Mississippi. I was too young to know my father. The names of the speculators were Carter Harrison and a man named Rulak. I never saw my father again, but I heard from him the second year of the surrender, through his brother and my aunt. My father died in Mississippi. The speculators bought up Negroes as a drover would buy up mules. They would get them together by Negro drivers, as the white men employed by the speculators were called. Their names were Jim Harris of Raleigh and S. Dred Thomas, who lived near Holly Springs in Wake County. Wagon trains carried the rations on the trip to Mississippi. The drivers would not start until they had a large drove. Then the slaves were fastened together with chains. The chain was run between them when they had been lined up like soldiers in double file. A small chain was attached to a Negro on the left and one to the Negro on the right, and fastened to the main chain in the center. Billy Askew was another speculator. He lived on the corner of Salisbury and Carver Street in Raleigh. Sometimes as many as 30 slaves were carried in a drove. They walked to Mississippi. My brothers and sisters are dead. Down on the plantations our houses were built of poles daubed with mud, with a rived board, split board. I had good beds, good clothes, and plenty to eat. We made it and we ate it. When a slave owner treated his slaves unusually good, some other slave owner would tell him that he was raising slaves who would rise against him. Lorenzo Franks, who owned me and my mother, was a Quaker. He treated his slaves unusually well. He would not sell any of them. His brother was an Ironside Baptist preacher, and he would tell his brother he was raising slaves who would rise against him. Franks owned 17 slaves. I don't know how many Stewart owned. When I was a child, I played marbles, hail-over, and bandy, a game played like golf. In striking the ball, we knocked it at each other. Before we hit the ball, we would cry, "Shins, I cry." Then we would knock the ball at our playmates. Sometimes we used rocks for balls. We got Christmas holidays from Christmas to New Year's Day. This was also a time when slaves were hired out or sold. You were often put on the auction block at Christmas. There was a whipping post, an auction block, and jail located on Courthouse Square, where the newsstand is now located on Fayetteville Street. There was a well in the yard. We were treated by doctors when sick. We were given lots of herbs. I did farm work in slavery time. I earned no money except what we made on patches. These patches were given to my mother by my master. We caught birds and game, sent it to town, and sold it for money. We caught birds and partridges in traps. Our master would bring them to town, sell them for us, and give us the money. We had a lot of possums and other game to eat. We got our food out of the big garden planted for the whole shebang. My master overseered his plantation. We didn't think much of the poor white man. He was down on us. He was driven to it by the rich slave owner. The rich slave owner wouldn't let his Negroes associate with poor white folks. Some of the slave owners, when a poor white man's land joined theirs and they wanted his place, would have their Negroes steal things and carry them to the poor white man and sell them to him. Then the slave owner, knowing where the stuff was, of course the slave had to do what his master told him, would go and find his things at the poor white man's house. Then he would claim it and take out a writ for him, but he would give him a chance. He would tell him to sell out to him and leave, or take the consequences. That's the way some of the slave owners got such large tracts of lands. The free Negro was a child by a white man and a colored woman, or a white woman and a Negro slave. A child by a white man and a Negro woman was set free when the man got ready. Sometimes he gave the free Negro slaves. Oscar Austin, an issue, was set free and given slaves by his master and daddy. Old man Oscar Austin lived by the depot in Raleigh. He is dead now. When a child by a Negro man, slave, and a white woman arrived, he could not be made a slave, but he was bound out until he was 21 years old. The man, whoever wanted him, had him bound to him by the courts and was his guardian until he was 21 years old. He could not be made a slave if he was born of a free woman. There were jails for slaves called dungeons. The windows were small. Slaves were put into jail for misdemeanors until court was held, but a white man could not be kept there over 30 days without giving bond. Whites and slaves were kept in the same jailhouse, but in separate rooms. They never taught me to read and write, and most slaves who got any reading and writing certainly stole it. There were rules against slaves having books. If the paddle rollers caught us with books, they would whip us. There were whipping posts on the plantation, but paddle rollers tied Negroes across fences to whip them. There was no church on the plantation. We had prayer meetings in the cabins. We had big times at corn shuckings and dances. We all had plenty of apple and peach brandy, but very few got drunk. I never saw a nigger drunk until after the surrender. We went to the white folks' church. We were partitioned off in the church. The paddle rollers visited our house every Saturday night generally. We set traps to catch the paddle rollers. The paddle rollers were poor white men. We stretched grapevines across the road, then we would run for them. They would follow and get knocked off their horses. I knew many of the paddle rollers. They are mostly dead. Their children, who are living now in Wake County and Raleigh, are my best friends, and I will therefore not tell who they were. I was caught by the paddle rollers in Raleigh. I would have been whipped to pieces if it hadn't been for a white boy about my age by the name of Thomas Wilson. He told them I was his nigger, and they let me go. We had brought a load of lightwood splints in bundles to town on a steer cart. This was near the close of the war. We had sold out one load of splints and had been paid for them in Confederate money. We had several bills. We went into a bar and bought a drink, each paying $1 a drink or $2 for 2 small drinks. The bar was in the house where the Globe clothing store is now located on the corner of Wilmington and Exchange Streets. Just as I swallowed my drink, a constable grabbed me by the back of the neck and started with me to the guardhouse, where they done their whipping. Down at the guardhouse, Nick Denton, the bartender, told Thomas Wilson, "Go tell the constable this is your nigger." Thomas came running up crying and told the constable I was his nigger. The constable told him to take me and carry me on home, or he would whip both of us. We then hitched our ox to the cart and went home. I do not believe in ghosts. I did not feel much elated over hearing I was free. I was afraid of Yankee soldiers. Our mistress told us we were free. I farmed first year after the war. We had no horses. The Yankees had taken the horses, and some of us made a crap with grubbing hoes. I think Abraham Lincoln was a man who aimed to do good, but a man who never got to it. I cannot say any more than that his intentions were good, and if he had lived he would have done more good. End of section 64.
Section 65 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Ex-Slave Recollections. An interview with Emma Stone, 77, of Heckstown, Durham County, May 21, 1937. My mammy was a free issue, and my pappy belonged to the Bells in Chatham County. Pappy was named Edmund Bell. Mammy was named Polly Mitchell. My sisters was Fanny, Jane, Anne, Josephine, Narcissus, and Cressy. My brothers was Liza, Hilliard, and another one, but I don't 'member his name. Yo knows dat I don't 'member much, but I does know dat days on de plantation was happy. When my mammy married Pappy, she moved to de Bell's plantation, so we chillens long wid her was like de udder slaves. The missus give us her old hoop skirts to play in, and we played nigh 'bout all de time. We was doing dis when de Yankees comed by. Dey drives der hosses up to de gate, and dey says dat dey is looking for Wheeler's cavalry. We knows dat it done passed der the day 'fore, but we is too skeered to say a thing. The Yankees stays round dar for a little while, and dey gathers rations. Then dey goes on atter Wheeler. We used to sing a song 'bout Wheeler's cavalry, but I only 'members dat it went like dis: Wheeler's cavalry marching on the battlefield. Wheeler's cavalry marching on the battlefield. It was really a game we played while we marched and pranced and beat on tin pans. The missus ain't caring 'cause we is being true to the South, she thinks. Shucks, we don't care nothing 'bout Wheeler 'cept what we hear, and that ain't so good. We don't care 'bout the Yankees nother, 'cause we is scared of dem. I heard grown folkses praising Lincoln, but I don't know much 'bout him. I don't know nothing much 'bout none of it, but I does know dat it was on a Sunday dat the picket was looking for Wheeler, and dat we was playing hide and seek. End of section 65.
Section 66 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. William Sykes, Ex-Slave Story. An interview with William Sykes, 78, of State Prison, Raleigh, North Carolina. My mammy, Martha, and me, we long to Mr. Joshua Long in Martin County, and my pa, Henry, longed to Squire Ben Sykes in Tyrrell County. Squire Sykes lived in what was called Gum Neck, and he owned 100 slaves or more, and a whole parcel of land. I lived with my mammy in Martin County from the first that I could remember. Me and my brothers, Henry, Benjamin, and Columbus, and my sisters, Hester, Margaret, Lucy, and Susan. I don't remember so much what happened for the war, of course, but I does remember a heap of little things. I knows that Mr. Long and Miss Catharine was good to us, and I remembers that the food and the clothes was good, and that there was a heap of fun on holidays. Most of the holidays was celebrated by eating candy, drinking wine and brandy. There was a heap of dancing to the music of banjos and hand slapping. We had corn shuckings and prayer meetings and sociables and singings. I went swimming in the creek, went with old Joe Brown possum hunting and coon hunting, and I sometimes went a fishing. When the Yankees comed, they come a tearing. They ain't done so bad in our neighborhood, 'cause hit warn't so full of the infernal Rebs, as the Yankees said. They took it the best o' everything, though, but they ain't doin' so much deruction. They even buyed terbacker from my mammy, and they paid her $1.50 a pound, stem and all. They paid her with shin plasters, which was green paper money, and the first that ever I seed. We slaves was skeered o' the Yankees, and for some reason I got sent to Pa at Squire Sykes' house in Tyrrell County. Squire Sykes come stomping in one day, and he says to my Pa, "Henry, them damn Yankees am comin' ter take my niggers away from me, and I ain't gwine ter stand fer hit nother. Let's you and me take these niggers and march straight ter the Blue Ridge Mountains, and up dar in them mountains dar won't be no trouble, case they won't dare come up dar atter us." Well, we got on the march for the mountains, and we march on ter Judge Clayton Moore's grandfather's place in Mitchell County, where we camps for several days. While we was dar, one day, and while Mr. Jim Moore, the judge's daddy, am in town, the missus axes my cousin Jane ter do the washing. Jane says that she's got ter do her own washing, and that she'll wash for the missus tomorrer. The missus says, "You ain't free yit. I want yer to know." "I knows that I's not, but I's gwine ter be free," Jane says. The missus ain't said a word then, but late Saturday night, Mr. Jim, he comes back from town, and she tells him 'bout it. Mr. Jim am some mad, and he takes Jane out on Sunday morning, and he beats her till the blood runs down her back. The patter-rollers was thick them days. Mr. Joe Jones was our regular patter-roller, and he give us the very devil. A few days after Jane got her beaten, we marches away. The women am left at Jamesville, but us mens and boys, we marches on ter Buncombe County, and we ain't seed no more Yankees. After the war, my pa and mammy went to live on Mr. Moore's plantation, and we had a hard time. A whole heap of times I has had nothing ter eat but one cupful of peas and a hunk of corn bread all day long. A white lady, Miss Douglas, give me a quart of milk every Sunday, but I had to walk 3 miles for it. We ain't walked none in slavery days ter what we done after the war, and I wished that the good old slave days was back. Thar's one thing, we old niggers was raised right, and the young niggers ain't. If'n I had my say-so, they'd burn down the nigger schools, give them pickaninnies a good spanking, and put 'em in the patch to work. Ain't no nigger got no business with no education nohow. Yes'm, they says that I is a murderer. Uncle William stroked his long white beard. I runned from this young nigger several times, and I was trying to run with my knife what I had been whittling with open in my hand. I was steered nigh to death. So when he grabs me, I throw up my hands, and in a minute he falls. I brushes the blood offen my coat, thinking that he has hurt me, and I sees the blood pouring from the jugular vein. I has sarved 10 months of my sentence, which they gived me, 3 to 5 years for manslaughter. What could I do? I stood up and I said, "Thank ye, Jedge." End of section 66. Read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 11th day of December, 2021.
Section 67 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Annie Tate, Ex-Slave Story. An interview with Annie Tate, 73, of 624 South Harrington Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I was a year old when the war was over, but of course I ain't knowing nothing 'bout slavery 'cept what my mammy said, and dat ain't so much. I reckon that it was a brother of Calvin Jones dat my mammy belonged ter. Anyhow, it was at Wake Forest. My mammy was Rosa Jones till she married Phil Perry, my pappy. My mammy's mammy, who also belonged to the Jones family, killed herself 'cause they sold her husband. Mammy said that she was 8 or 10 years old at the time. Old Marster was very fond of my grandpa, and he wouldn't allow the overseer to beat him, but old Marster went off on a trip, and he left young Marster in charge of the big farm and the whole slew of slaves that he owns. One day, after old Marster was gone, the overseer tried to run the hog over Grandpa and was cussing him scandalous. Grandpa cussed back at him, and then the overseer started to beat him. Grandpa drawed the hoe back over his head and tells him that if'n he comes a step closer that he am gwine to bust his head open. The overseer comes on, and the hoe sends on his head, chopping hit wide open. Old Marster ain't there, so young Marster makes several of the slaves hold him while he lashes him with the cowhide. He cuts his back all to pieces, and then he throws him in the barn, chained down to the floor. Grandmammy snook out to see him and whispered to him through the cracks. For one night she goes out there to the barn, and he am gone. She runs to young Marster and axes him whar am Grandpa, and he tells her that he am sold to a man from Mississippi, and that if'n she whimpers 'bout him selling the black bastard, that he will whoop her, then wash her down with vinegar, red pepper, and salt. Poor Grandma am nigh 'bout crazy, so she walks offen the plantation. Down on the edge of the plantation runs the news, so Grandma gets there and jumps in. My mammy am little, and she ain't got no brothers and sisters, so the missus takes her in the house with her. They said that the old Marster had a fit most when he finds out 'bout what been done dar while he am gone, so he am extra good to mammy. At the surrender, he calls his niggers in, and he says that he will give 'em permission to lib on the river plantation. They can build their shacks there and live there during their lifetime. Some of them does this, and for several years they stays on there. Mammy said that he told the Ku Kluxes to stay offen his land too, that he could manage his own niggers. End of section 67.
section number 68 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jacqueline Burrell Walton. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. R.S.Taylor, 710 South McDowell Street. My name is Ransom Sidney Taylor. I was born in slavery the 5th day of January, 1857. Adam Taylor was my father, and Mary Taylor my mother. My brothers were William H., Jesse, and Louis. Sisters, Virginia, Annie, and Isabella, all born in slavery. We all belonged to John Kane. He owned a plantation on Ramcat Road near Yates Mill, between Yates Mill and Penny's Mill. There was a whiskey still at Penny's Mill. There were 60 slaves in all, but Marster only kept 7 on the plantation with him at Yates Mill. Marster's sister Mary was our missus after he died. He died before the surrender. The war was going on when he died. He was a northern man. His sister came down to the funeral from New York and then went back. And then she came back to settle up the estate. She stayed here a long time then. She told all the slaves they were free. That was about the close of the war. Master John Kane was buried in the Catholic graveyard in Raleigh. His wife had died in the north, so my mother told me. We had plenty of something to eat: beans, peas, buttermilk, and butter and molasses, and plenty of flour. We made the wheat on the plantation and other things to eat. We didn't have clothes like they have now, but we had plenty of good and warm wove clothes. Our shoes had wooden bottoms, but were all right. We had prayer meetings on the plantation, and at times we went to the white folks' church. Marster was a Catholic, but we went to the Methodist church, Edenton Street Methodist Church. My master would not allow anyone to whip his Negroes. If they were to be whipped, he did it himself, and the licks he gave them would not hurt a flea. He was good to all of us, and we all loved him. We called our parents Pappy and Mammy most of the time. My master looked like you, just the same complexion and about your size. He weighed around 200 pounds, had curly hair like yours, and was almost always smiling like you. My master was an Irishman from the north. Mother and father said he was one of the best white men that ever lived. I remember seeing him sitting on the porch in his large armchair. He called me Lonnie, a nickname. He called me a lot to brush off his shoes. I loved him. He was so good. Our overseer was named John H. Whitelaw. He got killed at the rock quarry near the Federal Cemetery when they were carrying a boiler to the rock quarry a long time after the surrender, about 14 or 15 years ago. He and John were standing on the side of the boiler, and the boiler turned over and killed both of them. Marster's overseer was bad to us after Marster died. Nothing we could do would suit him, and he whipped the Negroes. We never heard the word Negroes until we moved to Raleigh after the surrender. They called us niggers and color folks. We were daring to have a book to study. It was against the Confederates' rules at that time. but Marster calls us in to have prayer meeting on Sunday mornings. I have seen patter rollers. They had 'em, but not when my Marster was living. They didn't come around then, but when he died, they come around every night. We never knowed when they was coming, you know. I never saw a slave really whipped. Marster would switch a slave sometime, but it was a matter of nothing, 'cause it didn't hurt much. We had good houses and plenty of good places to sleep, and we fared fine in slavery time. We called Marster's house, with its long porch, the dwelling house. When the Yankees came through, they told us we were free, and we didn't have to work for the Johnnies no more. We got everything all right on the plantation near Yates Mill. Then we moved to Raleigh. My mammy belonged to old Captain Hunter before she was married to Pappy. When she got married, the Taylors bought her, and she and Pappy stayed with the Taylors. As soon as we got the plantation fixed up, we moved to Raleigh, and Mammy and Pappy went back to her white folks, the Hunters. My father was a carpenter by trade and a preacher. He preached at St. Paul's Church on the corner of Harrington and Edenton Streets. We lived in Raleigh all our lives except Annie. She went to Brooklyn, New York, and died there about 4 years ago. I thinned corn and turned potato vines and helped look after and feed the stock. Our masters gave us some money, 5 and 10 cents at a time. That's the only way we got any money. We caught rabbits, hunting in the daytime, and possums, hunting at night. We hunted on holidays. We had holidays at lay-by time and the 4th of July. When we caught up with the work, we had nothing to do. We got Christmas holidays. I never saw a slave sold, and none never ran away. We went fishing in Swift Creek. I never saw a jail for slaves, and never saw any in chains. We played push and spin on the plantation. My mother looked after most of us when we were sick. She used roots, herbs, and grease, and medicine the overseer got in town. When my mother got through rubbing you, you would soon be well. When I first saw the Yankees, I was afraid of 'em. It was a curiosity to see 'em coming through the fields with them guns and things. They come down and talked with us and told us we were free, and then I was not so scared of 'em. I married Frances Lipton in 1885. We were married at the end of McDowell Street at Mr. Chester's home. Just a quiet wedding with about 30 friends present. I didn't think a thing about slavery while we fared mighty well, but it was bad on other plantations. I don't know anything about Booker T. Washington nor Jefferson Davis, but I know Jim Young. He was a Negro politician. I do not know much about Lincoln or Roosevelt. The Yankees just shot hogs and cows and took everything on the plantation they wanted. I can see 'em now running chickens. There was an old rooster. He said cluck, 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 cluck as he run. They shot his head off and he turned somersets a while and rolled over dead. Just seemed like if them Yankees pointed a gun at a chicken or a hog, they would roll over dead. They had live geese tied on their hosses. One old gander would say, quack, 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 as the hoss stepped along and jarred him. Some of the Yankee soldiers were carrying hams of hogs on their bayonets. That was a time, lawsy, lawsy, a time. One old hen, she had sense. When the Yankees were killing the rest of the chickens, she ran for the piney woods and hid there and stayed till the Yankees left Raleigh. Then she come home. Mammy caught her and raised about 40 chickens off her in Raleigh. End of section number 68.
Section 69 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Elias Thomas, 84 years of age, 521 Cannon Avenue, Raleigh, North Carolina. I was here when the Civil War was gone on, and I am 84 years old. I was born in Chatham County on a plantation near Moncure, February 1853. My master was named Baxter Thomas, and Mrs. was named Katy. She was his wife. I don't know my father's name, but my mother was named Phyllis Thomas. It took a smart nigger to know who his father was in slavery time. I just can remember my mother. I was about 4 or 5 years old when she died. My master's plantation was first the Thomas place. There was about 200 acres in it, with about 100 acres cleared land. He had 6 slaves on it. When I was 8 years old, he bought the Boylan place, about 2 miles from his first home, and he moved there. There was about 1,000 acres of land of it all, with about 300 acres cleared for farmin'. On the Thomas place his house had 6 rooms. On the Boylan place the house had 8 rooms. He brought in more slaves and took over all the slaves after John Boylan died. John Boylan never married. He was a mighty hard man to get along with, and Master Baxter Thomas was about the only one who could do anything with him when he had one of his mad spells. They were no blood relation, but Master got possession of his property when he died. It was fixed that way. We called the slave houses quarters. They were arranged like streets about 200 yards on the north side of the great house. Our food was pretty good. Our white folks used slaves, especially the children, as they did themselves about eatin'. We all had the same kind of food. All had plenty of clothes, but only 1 pair of shoes a year. People went barefooted a lot then, more than they do now. We had good places to sleep, straw mattresses and chicken feather beds, and feather bolsters. A bolster reached clear across the head of the bed. We worked from sun to sun, with 1 hour and a half to rest at noon or dinner time. I was so small I did not do much heavy work. I chopped corn and cotton mostly. The old slaves had patches they tended, and sold what they made and had the money it brought. Everybody eat out of the big garden, both white and black alike. Old Missus wouldn't allow us to eat rabbits, but she let us catch and eat possums. Missus didn't have any use for a rabbit. Sometimes we caught fish with hooks in Haw River, Deep River, and Cape Fear, and when it was a dry time and the water got low, we caught fish and seines. My master only had 2 children, both boys, Fred and John. John was about my age, and Fred was about 2 years older. They are both dead. My master never had any overseers. He made boss men out of his oldest slaves. We thought well of the poor white neighbors. We colored children took them as regular playmates. Master's boys played with them, too, and Master gave them all the work he could. He hired both men and women of the poor white class to work on the plantation. We all worked together. We had a good time. We worked and sang together, and everybody seemed happy. In harvest time a lot of help was hired, and such laughing, working, and singing. Just a good time in general. We sang the songs Crossin' Over Jordan and Bound for the Promised Land. I never saw a jail for slaves, but I have seen slaves whipped. I saw Creighton Abernathy, a overseer, whip a woman in the cotton patch on Doc Smith's farm, a mile from our plantation. I saw old man William Crump, a owner, whip a man and some children. He waited till Sunday morning to whip his slaves. He would get ready to go to church, have his horse hitched up to the buggy, and then call his slaves out and whip them before he left for church. He generally whipped about 5 children every Sunday morning. Willis Crump, a slave, was tied up by his thumbs and whipped. His thumbs was in such a bad fix after that they rose and had to be cut open. Willis was whipped after the war closed for asking for his wages and having words with old man Crump because he would not pay him. They fell out, and he called his friends in, and they took and tied him and whipped him. No books were allowed to slaves in slavery time. I never went to school a minute in my life. I cannot read and write. We had prayer meetings on the plantation about once or twice a week. We went to the white folks' church on Sunday. We went to both the Methodist and Presbyterian. The preacher told us to obey our masters. I remember the baptizings. They baptized in Shuttocks Creek and Haw River. I saw a lot of colored folks baptized. I do not remember any slaves running away from our plantation, but they ran away from old man Crump's and Richard Fawcett's plantations near our plantations. Jacob Fawcett ran away from Fawcett, and Tom Crump ran away from old man Crump. They ran away to keep from getting a whipping. Colored folks are afraid of bears, so one of the slaves who saw Tom Crump at night told him he saw a bear in the woods where he was staying. Tom was so scared he came home next morning and took his whipping. Both came home on account of that bear business, and both were whipped. When we got sick, Dr. Hughes, Dr. Witch, and Dr. Tom Buchanan looked after us. A lot of the slaves wore rabbit feet, the front feet, for good luck. They also carried buckeyes. I remember the Yankees. I will remember seeing them till I die. I will never forget it. I thought it was the last of me. The white folks had told me the Yankees would kill me or carry me off, so I thought when I saw them coming it was the last of me. I hid in the woods while they were there. They tore up some things, but they did not do much damage. They camped from Holly Springs to Avance Ferry on Cape Fear River. William Cross Plantation was about half the distance. The camp was about 30 miles long. General Logan, who was an old man, was in charge. I married Martha Sears when I was 23 years old. I married in Raleigh. My wife died in 1912. We had 14 children. 5 are living now. When the war closed, I stayed on 8 years with my master. I then went to North Carolina State Hospital for the insane. I stayed there 28 years. That's where I learned to talk like a white man. L.E. End of section 69.
Section number 70 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2, Mr. Bell's Plantation. An interview with Jacob Thomas, 97 years of age, of 1300 South Bloodworth Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I was born in Elberton County, Georgia, on the plantation of Master Tom Bell. My mammy, Isabel, used to live in North Carolina, but she was sold from her husband and baby and carried to Master Tom's place in Georgia. After she got there, she was married again and had me. That is, I reckon that she was married. I never did know my pappy. Mammy was sold in Smithfield on the slave block and carried off, chained behind a wagon. She turned round and looks back at her husband, who cries, and the overseer's lash cuts his back, 'cause they ain't allowed to cry at a cell. From the time I can first remember I worked on the farm, we planted cane, cotton, corn, and rice in the low grounds. We ain't had to work so powerful hard, and we was allowed a heap of pleasures. But some of us boys was mean, and we had to be whooped, like the time we tied 10 cans on the tail of Jinx, Master's fine hunting dog. The dog near run himself to death, and Master Tom had us whooped for it. He raised fine horses too, and he ain't allowed us boys to get close to them. But one Sunday when Uncle Amos went to sleep in the shade of the trees round the pasture, I gets on Lady, one of the fine young mares, and I flies away on her. She ain't used to nobody riding her bare back, so she kicks up quite a ruckus, but I sets on. Down across the pasture she goes, and I enjoys it fine till she steps in a hole and falls. The mare was crippled, but I leads her back and tries to get away without anybody seeing me. Old Amos has woke up this time, and of course he tells Master Tom. That was the worst whooping I ever had, I tell you. They streaked me all over. Then they makes me lie down, chained hand and foot all day long. That ain't done no good, though, 'cause I ride them horses every time I got the chance. I got married to Phoebe the year that the war began. She was a slim little brown-skinned gal, but looked so puny that you just naturally wants to take care of her. I ain't courted her for long 'cause the master gives his permission before I asks for it. We is married before the magistrate in June, before the war begun. Near about at the start of the war, I was took to Atlanta to help build the fort, and there I stays till the Yankees come a-rippin' and a-tearin'. They shoots the fort to pieces and then marches in and hangs up the old stars and stripes. We had 4 childrens then. Phoebe died and left me. After this, I moved to Star, South Carolina, and I marries Rebecca White, who also died 5 years ago, and so I come to live with Roberta. I don't know whether slavery was better or not. Most of the niggers claimed that all of the slaves was good, but I knows better. I done a heap of meanness, and once after I done so mean and got a whooping, I runned away. Comes night, and I comes back home, and the next day I done something or other to get another whooping for. There's this much we ain't worried about living then like we does now, and there's this much for being free. I has got 13 great-grandchildren, and I knows where they everyone am. In slavery times, they'd have been on the block long time ago. I always thought a lot of Lincoln 'cause he had a heap of faith in the niggers to think that he could live on nothing at all. End of section number 70. Read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, October the 18th, 2021.
Section 71 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Margaret Thornton. An interview with Margaret Thornton, 77 years old, of Hayti, 4 Oaks, North Carolina. I was born and raised on the plantation of J. Thornton of Harnett County. My mammy Lula, my pappy Frank, and my brother and sisters and me all was there slaves. The man I finally marries, Tom, am also a slave on the plantation. I was just 5 years old when the Yankees come, just a few of them to our settlement. I don't know the number of the slaves, but I does remember that they herded us together and make us sing a heap of songs and dance. Then they clap their hands and they says that we is good. One black boy won't dance, he says, so they puts him barefooted on a hot piece of tin, and believe me, he did dance. I know that my white folks hated the Yankees like pison, but they had to put up with their sass just the same. They also had to put up with the stealing of their property, what they had made their slaves work and make. The white folks didn't lose their temper much, though, and they avoids the Yankees. Now when they went protruding in the house, that am a different matter entirely. I was brung up to nurse, and I did my share of that too, honey. Let me tell you, I has nursed about 2,000 babies, I reckons. I has nursed grandmas and then their grandchilds. I reckon that I has closed as many eyes as the next one. Out of the war we stayed on, 'cause Mars was good to us and decided that we ain't got nowhere to go. I stayed on till I was 13 or 14, and then me and Tom married. He had a job at a sawmill near Dunn, so there we went to live in a new shanty. Tom never did want me to work hard while he was able to work, but I nursed babies off and on all the time he lived. When he was in his death sickness, he used to cry 'cause I had to take in washing. Since he's dead, I nurses mostly, but sometimes I ain't able to do nothing. I hopes to get my pension pretty soon, and that'll help a heap when I'm laid up, not able to turn my hand at nothing. End of section 71.
Section number 72 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jacqueline Burrell Walton. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Tillie, daughter of a slave. Caretaker, Cornwallis, Headquarters, corner 3rd and Market Streets, Wilmington, North Carolina. La, Miss Fanny, what you mean asking me what I knows about slavery? Why, I was born. Yes, after freedom. With a sweeping upward wave of a slender, shriveled brown arm to indicate the wide lapse of time between her advent and the passing of those long ago days. The frail little body might have been any age between 60 and 100, but feminine vanity rose in excited protest against the implication of age suggested by the question. Tillie is one of the landmarks of Wilmington. She was one of the servants in the house of which she is now caretaker at the time of the owner's death, and the heirs have kept her on, allowing her to live in the old slave quarters in the back garden. She sits in the sun on the coping of the brick wall, or across the street on the low wall of the grounds around St. James Church. Children and their nurses gather there on the lawn, and Tillie holds forth at length on any topic from religion and politics to the cutting or losing of teeth. She makes the bold statement that she can tell you something about everybody in Wilmington. That is, everybody we knows. There is a general uneasiness that perhaps she can. Little escapes the large, keen brown eyes, and the ears are perpetually cocked. After several conversations in passing, memory was coaxed to the time when, as a very young child, she remembered incidents of slave times which she had heard from her mother. My mother belonged to the Bellamys and lived on their plantation across the river in Brunswick. It was the biggest place anywhere hereabouts. I was raised on it too. Of course, it was in the country, but it was so big we was a town all to ourselves. Did any of the colored people leave after freedom? Of course they didn't. Weren't no place to go. None of us was accustomed to anybody but rich folks, and of course their money was gone. I've heard Miss Bellamy tell how her children made enough out of potatoes to buy their clothes right on that plantation. So we all stayed right there. My mother brought us all up right there on the plot she'd been living on all the time. When I come along, we had plenty to eat. She had a whole passel of us, and we always had plenty of collards and poke and cornbread, plenty of fish. Oh, yes, stuff was sold. I can remember timber being cut, and our folks got some wages to buy clothes. We didn't have no school, but we had a church. Soon as I was big enough, I came to Wilmington to work. I never has lived with none but the best. My mother always said, Tillie, always tied to the best white folks, them that has influence, 'cause if you gets into trouble, they can get you out. I've stuck to that. I've never had any traffic with any but the blue bloods, and now look at me. I'm not able to work, but I got a home and plenty to eat, and I ain't on no relief. And Tillie can show hold her head up. End of section number 72.
Section 73, Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Ellen Trell, age 73, 20 McKee Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. Needham Price owned about 50 slaves, and Mother and I were among that number. He was a very rich man and owned a large plantation in Wake County, North Carolina, near the town of Knightdale. My father belonged to Tom Bodie, way down in Edgecombe County, and Mother and I went by the name of Bodie. My father's given name was Haywood. Mother's name was Caroline. The fare was bad in regard to food and clothing, but the slave quarters, though small and shanty-like in appearance, were warm and dry. The rules were strict and the privileges few. Mother was whipped and scarred by the lash. So bad the scars were on her when she died. I've seen them many times. There were no books of any kind allowed the slaves, and no social gatherings tolerated. Slaves were allowed to go to the white folks' church, and at times all slaves were carried to services at the church. The preacher told them to obey their marsters and mistresses that the Bible said obey. Marster lived in a large house with 14 rooms, which the slaves called the big house. He had 4 house servants to do his and Mrs. bidding. They were specially trained, as Marster did a lot of entertaining in slavery time. Marster and Mrs. had a lot of parties where they served a lot of good food and various kinds of liquors to their guests. When Marster was in his cups, he was mighty rough, and any of the slaves who displeased him at these times were liable to get a beating. I've heard a lot of talk about ghosts and witches among the colored folks. I've seen a few who had spells put on them by witches. My mother had a spell put on her, and she lay in bed, talking to herself and sweating drops of sweat as big as the end of my finger. She would groan and say, "Go away, evil spirit, go away," but the spell would not leave her until she went to a white witch doctor and got cured. After the surrender, Father came up from Edgecombe County, and he and Mother went and worked with Mr. Ruth Dunn of Wake County. They stayed close, never going out of the county. Mother, after a year or two at Mr. Dunn's, began to think about going back home. She was free, and though her old master had treated her rough, she loved the missus and said she'd rather stay with Master Price than anyone else. Father went to see Mr. Price. He told him to tell Caroline to come on back home and that he sure better bring her back. Mother said when she got back home they all had a general good time cooking, eating, and laughing. Marster told her he never wanted her to leave him again. Mother said she was so full of gladness she could not reply, so she just stood there and cried. Marster walked off. Mother took charge of the house, and father just about took possession of the farm. He looked after the stock, all the farm tools, kept plenty of wood on the woodpile all the year round. Father and mother carried the keys and acted like the place belonged to them. They got most of the slaves who were agreeable to come back. Marster gave them work, and he loafed and prospered because he trusted the negroes so much. They felt the responsibility put upon them, and they worked for his interests. Mother and father stayed there until they died. I stayed with father and mother until I married Badger Farrell. Then we stayed in a cabin on the plantation several years. Most of my life was spent near Nightdale, Wake County, until my husband died 15 years ago. I had 8 children, 4 girls and 4 boys. They are all dead except one, a boy, whom I have lived with in Raleigh since my husband died. I think slavery was a bad thing. This story is the things my mother and father told me of slavery and my own observations since I became old enough to remember the general happenings. Mother said the place, which had been a place of torture in slavery days, turned out to be a haven of rest after slavery, a home where peace, plenty, and contentment reigned supreme. End of section 73.
Section 74 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Curtis Richardson. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Henry James Trentham. Raleigh, North Carolina, Route 2, age 92 years. I was born the 2nd day of December, 1845. That would make me 92 years of age. I was born on a plantation near Camden, South Carolina. I belonged to Dr. Trentham, and my missus was named Elizabeth. My father was named James Trentham, and my mother was named Laurie. I had 2 brothers and 1 sister. We all belonged to Dr. Trentham. Master's plantation was an awful big plantation with about 400 slaves on it. It was a short distance from the watery river. The slave houses looked like a small town, and there was grist mills for corn, cotton gin, shoe shops, tanning yards, and lots of looms for weaving cloth. Most of the slaves cooked at their own houses, that they called shacks. They was give a allowance of rations every week. The rations was tolerably good, just about like people eat now. There was a jail on the place for to put slaves in, and in the jail there was a place to put your hands in called stocks. Slaves was put there for punishment. I see lots of slaves whooped by the overseers. Master had 4 overseers on the place, and they drove us from sun up till sunset. Some of the women plowed barefooted most of the time and had to carry that row and keep up with the men and then do their cooking at night. We hated to see the sun rise in slavery time 'cause it meant another hard day, but then we was glad to see it go down. Master lived in a large 2-story house with about 12 rooms in it. We called it the plantation house. There was a church on the plantation, and both white and black went to preaching there. There was Sunday school there too. The preacher told us to obey our missus and master. He told us we must be obedient to him. Yes, sir, that's what he told us. Some of the slaves run away. When they was caught, they was whooped and put in the stocks in the jail. Some of the slaves that ran away never did come back. The overseers told us they got killed, reason they never come back. The patrollers come round every now and then, and if you was off the plantation and had no pass, they tore you up with the lash. Master and missus rode around in a carriage drawn by 2 horses and driven by a driver. They had 4 women to work in the houses as cooks, maids, and the like. No hunting was allowed a slave if no white man was with 'em, and they was not allowed to carry guns. The corn shuckings was a great time. Master give good liquor to everybody then. When anybody shucked a red ear, he got an extra drink of whiskey. We had big suppers then and a good time at corn shuckings. After the shucking at night, there would be a wrestling match to see who was best on the plantation. We got a week holiday at Christmas. Then was the time shoes was give to the slaves, and the good times generally lasted a week. At labor time was another big time. That was about the 4th of July. They give a big dinner, and everybody ate all the barbecue and cake they wanted. I saw slaves sold at Camden. Master carried some slaves there and put 'em on the auction block and sold 'em. I was carried, but I was not sold. I went with the old doctor. I was his pet. They carried slaves away from the plantation in chains. They carried 5 or 6 at a time. If a nigger didn't suit 'em, he sold 'em. Missus didn't like for 'em to beat 'em so much nohow. The old doctor had 3 boys, William, Sidney, Henry, and 2 girls, Missy and Carrie. They would not allow slaves no books, and I can't read and write. I did not get any learning. When a slave died, there was only a few to go to the burying. They didn't have time to go. They was so busy working. The slaves was buried in plain wood boxes, which was made by slave men on the plantation. Our master looked after us when we got sick. I married Ella Davis 31 years ago in South Carolina, near Camden. We had 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls. Slavery was pretty rough, and I'm glad it's all over. End of section 74.
Section 75 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Patterson of Monmouth County, New Jersey. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Jane Ann Prevett Upperman, 74 years old, of 330 West South Street. I wasn't living in Raleigh when my mother was free from slavery. We was living in Nash County, right near the border of Wake County. We belonged to Shirley Brantley. Our missus was named Panina. I was born a slave, but I was only about 2 years old at the time of the surrender. I am 74 now. I was born in April. I had my age in a Bible, but the book got tore to pieces and my age got lost. We lived on Master Brantley's plantation, and the slave quarters was near the great house. Mother said she worked in the field from sun to sun. They did not eat breakfast in the morning before they went to work. It was cooked and put on the shelf, and they had breakfast at about 11 o'clock in the day. Mother said sometimes the flies got to the meat and bloated before they could come in and eat it. Mother said the food was bad and not fixed right. There was a lot of the slaves divided among master's children. I can't remember how many. Master was a soldier, and when he come and told Mother she was free, Mrs. Panina told her, "No, you ain't free. You's got to stay here and work right on." Massa told her if she had been through with what he'd been through with, she could give Mother up as free as taking a drink of water. When the war ended, Father come and got Ma and took her on his master's plantation. My father was named Carol Privet, and my mother was Cherry Brantley. But after she was free, she begun to call herself by my father's name, Privet. Father belonged to Jimmy Privet across Tar River from where Ma lived. He lived near a little place named Cascade. We lived there at Father Master's place till most of the children was about grown. Then Father bought a place in Franklin County from Mr. Jack Griffin. He stayed there long enough to pay for the place. Then he sold it and we moved to Clayton. At this time, all the older children was married, and that's what dissatisfied my father. He had nobody to help him work. Arch, Frank, and Dennis was married. Mary was married. 2 gals and 1 boy was left single. There were 7 of the children. We moved from Clayton to Raleigh. I was married in Raleigh. I married William Upperman. Mother and father died in Raleigh. Mother died right here in this house. My mother and father couldn't do no writing, but father could read a little. He could read hymns and the Bible. I ain't remember nothing about slavery, except what I heard 'em say. Some say they had a good time and liked slavery. That was when they had good masters. Then some say they had a hard time and didn't like it. That was when they had bad masters. Slavery was good and bad according to the kind of master you had. My husband died September 6, 1925. I am unable to work. I had a stroke on one side. I was just hanging around home. My daughter works for the WPA and supports me, but now she has been laid off. My children, some of them live in Harlem, New York. But they has to have so much to live on, they can't help me. They sends me a Christmas present most of the time, and they remembers me on Mother's Day sometime. I ain't signed up with any of the places to get money yet. Don't see what I's gonna do. I ain't got enough money to pay bus fare to the registering place other side of town.
End of section 75.
Section 76 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Ex-Slave Stories, an interview by Mary A. Hicks with Ophelia Whitley of Zebulon, Wake County, North Carolina, May 12, 1937. I was born at Wakefield in 1841, here in Wake County. My mammy was named Eliza, and my pappy was named Thomas. Dar was 11 of us chillens, Francis, Sally, Anne, Jane, Patty, Louisa, Alice, Virginia, Sam, Haywood, Booby, and me. We belonged to Mr. Augustus Foster, and he was right good to us, even though he had 100 or so other slaves. I members one whooping I got when I was little, 'bout a big matter dat looked little at the time. Mens would come by in kivered wagons, we called dem speckled wagons, and steal Marse Gus nigger chillins. He had lost a heap of money dat way, so he forbids us of goin' out ter de road, and he orders us to stay way back in de rear of de house. One day we sees a drove of dese wagons comin', and we flies down ter de road. De marster catches us, and I flies, but he hobbles to our cabin on his crutches, and he pinches me, pokes me wid de crutch, and slaps my face. His son Billy was de overseer, and he was good to get along wid, but he sure made dem darkies work. De women plowed and grubbed, and I's known dem to leave de field, go to de house and find a baby, and be back at work de next day. Dat ain't happen often, though. Mostly they done light work for a week or so. The babies was carried to Aunt Hannah's house, and she raised 'em all so's dat the other women could work. The mammies ain't even 'member which was their chillens half the time, so there was no moanin' when somebody got sold. I 'members a slave sale, and hirin' the marster tell Cindy and Bruce to act up for the benefit of the buyers. Cindy said that she could do everything, so she brung a good price, but Bruce, at her sayin' that he could do it all, was told to hitch up a hoss in a hurry. He got the hoss and turned his head to the spatterboard and tried to hook the hoss up hind part before. The marster can't find no buyer, so he whoops Bruce awful batter. He gets him home, but that black boy says, "Mars, you can kill me, but I'd ruther stay on hyah." I seed niggers in chains, but they was travelin', or was mighty bad niggers. We had log cabins to live in, and they was comfortable, but we ain't had much jubilees, the marster not believin' in such things. We warn't teach nothin', not even religion, and we got whooped if we was catched wid a piece of paper or a slate. The white folks warn't teached nothin' then, and you know they won't gwine to take no trouble with the niggers. The niggers had a doctor dough when they got sick, same as the white folks, and they got a lot of spring tonic and such made out of barks and roots. When the slaves got married, they done it this way. The marster hilt a broom, and they solemnly steps over it twiced. Then they kissed, and they was married. Course, dar was something dat the marster said, but I done forgot what it was. When we heard that the Yankees was comin', some of the niggers went for the woods and stayed till atter the surrender, but most of us stayed on and worked just the same. My master made his own brandy and whiskey, and when the Yankees come, he was a rich man. His smokehouse was full of hams, and he hid 'em in the ceilin' of my mammy's shack, and he buried them barrels of brandy, but the Yankees done found it all, and they ain't left nothin'. I 'members how some of them Yankee officers cussed in front of my musses, and how I told 'em that they mought be Yankees, but they won't half raised at that. Atter the surrender, my marster had to make the slaves leave, but he moved my pappy's cabin furder, and we just stayed on same as always till he died. I 'members mighty well when my mammy and pappy got married, 'cause I seed it 2 years atter the surrender. There was 2 witches lived in our neighborhood. They was sisters named Miss Quinny and Miss Tilda, and I seed them brewin' coffee a many a time and pouring it out in a long neck gourd. They done a powerful lot of things which I can't recollect right this minute anyhow. They was witches. I used to see ghosts on this very road nigh 'bout ever night. They was white and spongy looking, and they set under the bushes and holler and holler and holler. I's poured water on 'em many a time, but it ain't done no good. Do you know, child, slavery was a good thing, but folks has improved a lot since then, and the Yankees warn't half as good to us as our old marster and missus was, even if'n they did put a stop to the Ku Klux Klan beatin' sorry niggers that had ort ter be hung. End of Section 76.
Section 77 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Curtis Richardson. Ex-Slave Story. An interview on May 19, 1937, with Tom Wilcox of Method. I was born on March 18, 1856, during the biggest snow that ever hit Eastern Carolina. They says that it was up to the roof. The place where I was born was in Warren County, just across the Halifax line. My mammy's master was Mr. B. Oscar Harris, and his wife was named Martha. My mammy's name was Alice, and my papa's name was Camlin. I had 3 brothers, Little Barry, Cornelius James, and C.J. There was 4 girls, Anne, Patty, Penny, and Mary Frances. The white folks was good to us, and we loved them, but we wanted to be free, 'cause the Lord done make us all free. My missus was a religious woman, and I can't tell you the number of times she has beat me 'cause I done some kind of work on a Sunday. We went to church every Sunday, and we wasn't allowed to cuss and such things. I was 9 when the war commenced. During the war, and I was working in the field, along with the 50 or 60 other slaves, there wasn't ne'er a Yankee track made in our section, and we ain't knowed much about the war. As I done told you once, we was fed and clothed good, and we lived for each other. But my papa belonged to one man, and my mammy to another one, and so we wanted to be all together. Out of the war, we stayed on till 69. Then we come to Raleigh. Most of the women's and children's was sent by the train, but me and Pappy and Barry, we walked all the way by Lewisburg and driving Pappy's 13 heads of cattle. In 1871, we bought 10 acres of land at Method for $3 an acre and moved out here. No, ma'am, we ain't like Jeff Davis, but we did like Mr. Lincoln. I remembers a verse of the song that we sung during the first of the war. It goes this way. Jeff Davis is a rich man, Lincoln is a fool. Davis rides a big fat horse, Lincoln rides a mule. Knick-knack, they say, walk old Georgia row. There was another song I remembers, but I can't think of no games, 'cause we ain't never played none. Yours heard that after a dog gets so full of fleas, he can't tote no more. Well, that's the way I is. I peddles my peanuts, but I barely makes a living. Here's the song. Do the best I remembers it. And it was sung after the war. Old Confederate has done played out true ball, true ball. Old Confederate has done played out true ball, say I. And old General Lee can't fight no more. We'll all drink stone blind, Johnny's go marching home. I bought me a chicken for 50 cents, true ball, true ball. I bought me a chicken for 50 cents, true ball, say I. I bought me a chicken for 50 cents and the son of a bitch done jumped the fence. We'll all drink stone blind, Johnny's go marching home. 1861, true ball, true ball. 1861, true ball, say I. 1861, and that's the year the war begun. We'll all drink stone blind, Johnny's go marching home. 1865, true ball, true ball. 1865, true ball, say I. 1865, the Yankees ain't only alive. We'll all drink stone blind, Johnny's go marching home. End of section 77.
Section 78 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Patterson of Monmouth County, New Jersey. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Section 78. Catharine Williams, 2214 Barker Street. My name is Catharine Williams. I was born December 25th, 1851. I remember my mother, but I do not know anything about my father. My mother's name was Adeline Williams. Mother baked ash cakes, but my children would not eat them. She died 50 years ago. I had 4 children when she died, but I had 3 boys and 2 girls. I was born in Virginia, but I cannot tell what part. I was 4 years old when my mother brought me to North Carolina. Our old master, Dabney Cosby, moved from Virginia to North Carolina then. We came straight into Raleigh, North Carolina, and have been living in Raleigh ever since. We were the Williamses when owned by Cosby, and we were never sold again, but remained in the same family till we were set free after the surrender. We had good food, fair clothing, and comfortable sleeping places. I know what a pallet is. All slept on them a lot in slavery days, especially when it was hot weather. I make some now sometimes. My missus was named Fanny. I do not know how many slaves they owned, but master did not have a plantation. He lived in town. He was a brick mason and he made brick. He had 2 brick kilns. Our missus and master were kind to us, but they did not teach us to read and write. I learned to read and write since the surrender. I went to church and Sunday school. There were no Negro preachers, but we attended the white folks' church. We did not have any prayer meetings because our homes were in the white folks' yard. I was never whooped, and mother and myself were well treated, so I have no complaint to make against our white folks. The first work I done was nursing the children in the home. Next, I waited on the table, then general housework. At the last days of the war, Wheeler's cavalry camped around my house at night. They told us the Yankees would be in Raleigh the next morning, and sure enough, they came in next morning. If the citizens had not gone out and surrendered Raleigh to the Yankees, they would have torn Raleigh to pieces. We were living on the corner of Hargett and Dawson Streets. The Yankees done us no harm. They done all right in Raleigh. They did not take nothing around home. They put out guards around the homes by the time they got in. We were not afraid of 'em, none of us children.
neither white nor colored. They played such purty music and was dressed so fine. We run after the band to hear them play. I heard talk of the patrollers, but never saw any. I knew very little about the jail in Raleigh for slaves. I never saw any slaves sold or any in chains. I never knew of any slaves running away to the north. We children, both white and colored, enjoy the Christmas holidays together. We played running and jumping and hide and seek. We had doctors when we got sick. Dr. Johnson was one of them. After the war, we stayed on with Master and Mrs. until they died. I have been on Oberlin Road about 25 years. No, sir, what you talking about? No, there were no Negro schools in Raleigh at the time of the surrender, but I have had a good time all my life as far as being treated right is concerned. I have never married. I will have to find that man yet, and at this age, I don't expect to find him. Never found that man yet. I'm staying with my niece. I don't know nothing about Abraham Lincoln. He helped us to be free. I knew nothing about Jefferson Davis, Booker T. Washington, or Roosevelt. I know very little about Jim Young. Only he was a politician. End of section 78.
Section number 79 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2, Reverend Handy Williams, Dunn, North Carolina. My name is Handy H. Williams. When the war went up, I was 12 years old, 12th of March. I belonged to Blaney Williams, and his wife was named Polly. My mother was named Margaret Williams, and my father was named Sam Williams. I do not remember my grandmother and grandfather. Can't remember them. My father lived in Greene County. The plantation was in Greene County. There were about 190 acres in the farm, and there was about 25 slaves on it. We lived in Greene County till the war went up. We had plenty to eat, good clothes, and a nice place to sleep. Master was not good to us, but he gave us plenty to eat and wear. He worked us from light till dark, and then my mother had to do housework after working in the fields all day, and father had to do the feeding or pick cotton at night. We had no holidays. Prayer meetings were not allowed in the quarters, and a slave doesn't to be caught with a book in his hand. The patrollers come by often, and they caught and whooped the slaves many times. Master whooped slaves for most anything. Sometimes he would get mad and whoop us when he hardly had an excuse. Yes, sir, he would get drunk and whoop somebody just 'cause he was mad. Some of the slaves run away. My Uncle Needham Williams run away. When he come back, he was whooped, and they put him up and sold. Aunt Chaney, my mother's sister, was put up and sold. She was sold away from her children. When the war went up, she come back home. My Aunt Beatty was sold on the block in Fayetteville. I remember her well, but we've never heard from her since. She never come back after the surrender. God only knows what become of her. When the war went up, we went to Harnett County to Mr. Jim Searle's place, about 3 miles from where this town now stands. Dunn was not here then. We stayed there 5 years and then moved to Mingo in what is now Sampson County on the Louis Martin II place, and my father bought a place. The deed called for 199 acres, more or less. That's what the deed called for. We paid for the place, but my father mortgaged the place. He didn't lose it because it was fixed so that no one could sell or mortgage it while any of their heirs was living. All are dead except Pink Williams and myself, and the land fell back to us. Mammy and Daddy are both dead long time ago, about 25 years. They had overseers on Master's farm in Greene County, and they was mean to the slaves. I was not big enough to work much, but they had me feeding stock and helping around the house. We children didn't play any games. We was afraid to play around the white folks. Master was a rip snorter, and he would get you if you got in his way. He lived in the great house not far distance from the quarters, but we did not go there unless we had to go there to work. Yes, sir. You know how children is when they hear wagons a-coming and a big crowd marching together. Yes, sir, I remember the Yankees. They rode their horses against the fences and tore 'em down. They come in the yard and turned over the bee gums. They shot the chickens. They would say, "There he goes, shoot him, shoot him." And then the guns would go bam, 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 and the chickens would fall dead. They shot the dogs in the yard. Of course, to heaven, I'm telling the truth. They took the meat and destroyed most everything at Master's. After they left, if you could get a few beans or peas, they was mighty good. People ate tater peelings, and some come near starving. I was mighty lucky, and what I got it from the southern white folks. They've been mighty good to me since the war. I have worked for the town about 35 years, and I work for it now. I ain't able to do much now, but I have a section of the courthouse. I keeps it might clean. I know nothing much about the great men you ask me about. Don't remember much about 'em. I think slavery was a bad thing. Yes, sir, I sure does. End of section 79, read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, August the 13th, 2021. Section number 80 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. John Thomas Williams, 77 years old, 1272 Pettigrew Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I don't know who I am, nor what my true name is. I was born December the 25th, 1860, on a plantation in New Hanover County. The plantation belonged to John Williams, whose wife was named Isabella, and the farm was on land which is now in the corporate limits of Wilmington, North Carolina. The reason I don't know who I am is that I don't remember my father and mother or any of my people. When I got so I could remember anything, I was with the Williams family. Master and Mrs. and their family are the only ones I ever looked upon as my people. They never told me who I was. After the war, I stayed with them a long time and helped them on the farm. They run a truck farm. I got along all right while I was with the Williams family, but when I got grown, I left them. I loved them, but I realized I was a nigger and knew that I could never be like them and that I was one to myself. When I left, I went to Little Washington, North Carolina, then to Plymouth. I stayed at these places several years working as a hand on truck farms. From there, I went to Charlotte, Greensboro, and Norfolk. I then went north and stayed 8 years in New York City as a waitman for a white man and his family. I then went to Plymouth, North Carolina. I married Maggie Swan, a former sweetheart, as soon as I got back to Plymouth. We had 2 children. She lived 6 years. I then married Mary Davenport of Little Washington. We had 7 children. She died, and I come to Raleigh and married Maggie Towle. We had no children by our marriage. I own no home and have never owned one. Excepting the 8 years I spent in New York City, my life has been spent in farming. I farm some now and do little jobs for the white folks. I don't know much about slavery, as I was too young to know much about it. There was other slaves belonging to Master Williams, but I don't remember any of them because when I got so I could know what it was all about, they were free and gone from the plantation. I have asked thousands of questions trying to find out who my people are, but no one has ever told me who I am or who my people are. If I have any brothers and sisters, I don't know it. I have nothing to say about being partly white. I leave that to your imagination. I have thought about it a lot. I don't know. I have been blessed with good health. I am breaking now, but I am still able to do light jobs. I am a good fiddler. The white folks have taught me to do lots of different things. I have had very few advantages, and I cannot read and write. I have never been in jail in my life. I can give good references from dozens of white folks. I try to live right, be honest, and above all, give my fellow man a square deal. End of section number 80, read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, August the 18th, 2021.
Section 81 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Interview with Lizzie Williams, ex-slave, 35 Mack Street, Asheville, North Carolina, by Marjorie Jones, August 24, 1937. I was born in Selma, Alabama. I can't mind how long ago, but just about 90 years. I come to this country about 1882. Yes, I was purty poorly these days, and I was getting homesick for my old home. I was born and lived on old man Billy Johnson's plantation, thousands acres of ground and plenty of niggers. My pappy, he allus belonged to old man Billy. He not such a bad man, but the Lord knows I's seed better ones. When I's right smart size Missy Mixon, she was Marse Billy's wife, sister, she get Marse Billy to let her have me. She war a good woman. She took me to town to live and make a little white girl outen me. Y'all knows what I means. I got treated more like the white folks than the rest of the niggers. But 'twarn't long afore Missy sent me to New Orleans to nurse the sick child of her sister. I never war satisfied down there. Everybody's so different. But the next year we go back to Alabama. I went to Marse Ellis Mixon's. He trouble mean to his niggers, but I belong to the missus. She allus treat me good. All the little niggers have to learn to work when they little. Get out and pull weeds. They never had no time to play. Most them niggers were scared to death, just like the ones on Billy Johnson's plantation. They know they get whooped just like a mule if and they act like they don't want to work. They never get much to eat, just side meat, cornbread, and 'lasses. Oh, Billy, he had overseers what was mean to the poor niggers. Sometimes they ties them up and they strip them, and they whoops them with cowhide, else they lets other niggers do it. All the niggers have to go to church just like the white folks. They have a part of the church for themselves. After the war, we have a church of our own. All the niggers love to go to church and sing. I mind a lot of the songs we used to sing in the fields. I mind my pappy used to sing in the field. Get on board, little children, get on board. Sometimes they baptize in the river. Then they sing, I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready, good Lord, to walk in Jerusalem just like John. John say the city was just 4 square, to walk in Jerusalem just like John, but I'll meet my mother and father there, to walk in Jerusalem just like John. I members about the paddy rollers. The niggers have to get a pass from the massa or the missus if they go anywhere. The paddy rollers just like police. About dozen of them ride long together. First thing they say, "Wha yo pass?" Then if'n yo have one, they let you go, but if'n you don't have one, they strips yo to the waist and they lambs yo good till the blood comes. Sometime they rolls you over a barrel and lambs you while the barrel rolls. I mind a tale my pappy tell about one time he sees the paddy rollers coming. He scared to death 'cause he didn't have no pass. He know if'n they finds him what they do. So pappy gets down in the ditch and throws sand and grunts just like a hog. Sure enough they thinks he a hog, and they pass on, 'cept one who was behind the others. He say, "That am the gruntinest old hog I ever hear. I think I go see him." But the others, they say, "Just let that old hog alone and mind you own business." So they pass on. Pappy he laughed about that for a long time. I mind old Mose, he have monthly pass from the massa, but he forget it one day, and the paddy rollers whoop him and throw him in the calaboose. In the morning, when the massa wake and find no fresh water and no fire in the stove, and the cows not milk, he say, "I know Mose in the calaboose," and he hab to go atter Mose. Lots of the poor niggers run away, but 'twarn't no use. There warn't no place to go. They was allus looking for you, and then you had to work harder than ever. Suds all kinds of punishment you get. Then they nearly starve you to death, just feed you on bread and water for long time. The niggers never know nothing about learning, just work all days fit for. The only thing I ever do with a book is just to dust it off. I mind 2 little niggers whose missy teach them to read. Emily, she looked like a white gal. She was treated just like she white. Her daddy was a white man. Emily was a smart gal. She belonged to one of the Johnson men's. She do all the sewing for her missy. When the missy go to buy clothes for the children, she allus take Emily along. Her pappy pay no more attention to her than to the rest of the niggers. But the missy, she was good to her. She never stay in the quarters. She stay in the house with the white folks. But Emily have the saddest look on her yaller face, 'cause the other niggers whisper about her pappy. Many the poor nigger women have chillin for the massa. That is, if'n the massa a mean man. They just tell the niggers what to do, and they know better than to fuss. Old missus, she good to me. I mind one time I got double mad and say some ugly words. Marcellus he come up behind me, and he say, "Lisbeth, I gwanna wall up yo good for dat." I mens crying and run to the missus, and she say, "Look here, Ellis Mixon, y'all mind yo own business and look at her, yo own niggers. This one belongs to me." Just same when the missus went upstairs, Marcellus take me in the smokehouse and start to hit me. I yell for the missus, and when she comes she plenty mad. Mars say he never meant to whoop me, just scare me little. I mind 'bout the war. We niggers never know what it 'bout. We just go on and work, never see nothing, never hear nothing, never say nothing. But the war all round. Every day we hear that the Yankee soldiers comin', the plantations was getting robbed. Everybody kept a hiding things. It was a trouble time. I mind plain when they comes to Selma. All the folks was at church when the Yankees come. They warn't no fighting much. They didn't have time. They just march in and take the town. But oh, Lordy, that night they burned the stores and houses and take all the things they want. Cannons and guns all round. It war trouble sight. Morris Ellis Plantation, about 15 mile from Selma on Pea Ridge. I mind one night Morris come home from town and he say, Elizabeth. I say, yes, sir. He say, bring me some fresh water from the spring. I run as fast as I can and bring the water and give it to him. Then he say, Elizabeth, the Yankees am coming soon, and I knows you's gwine to tell 'em where I hide all my longings, guns and everything. No, I says, just why would I tell where yo hide yo guns and things? Missy come in then and she say, go on and let Lizzie alone. Better be feared them niggers you done so mean to gwine tell. That's all you got to be feared of. But you let Lizzie alone. She belong to me. Morris Ellis, he go out and hide some most stuff. That night, the soldiers burned Selma. That war on Sunday. Next night, we wake up in the middle of the night, and the house what we keep the best carriage and horse was a burning. The poor horse done break out in the barn and was a running round all over the place a screaming, with her poor back burnt tubble. We never find out if the Yankees set the barn fire or not. Guess they did. They done set Morris Hyde's house afire and burn it to the ground, with Morris Hyde in it. Morris Hyde, he had plantation in New Orleans, and when the Yankees take the town, Morris Hyde, he promised not to leave, but when the soldiers know he escape and come to his house on Pea Ridge, so when the Yankees find him here, they burn him in the house with all his longings. On the Tuesday morning, after they burned Selma, I wake up to see Morris Ellis Plantation all surround with Yankee soldiers. I were nigh scared to death. I so afraid they hurt me and Missy, but they didn't. They just marched through the house, and when they see Morris Ellis, they ask him for he guns and things they want. Morris Ellis showed them where the things were. 'Twarn't no use to do anything else. I take Morris Frank's backer and hide it in the missus' trunk. Then when the soldiers get what they want, they laugh and march way on the hill. After the surrender, all the niggers just lost. Nowhere to go, nothing to do, lest they stay with their massa. Nobody had anything but Federate money, and it no good. My pappy had about $300, but 'twarn't no good 'tall. All some of the white folks think of war, killing the poor niggers what worked for them for years. They just scour the country and shoot them, especially the young men. One day they come down the road towards my pappy. They start asking questions about what he gwine to do now he free. What I gwine to do, says pappy, what can I do? I just stay on the plantation and help old massa if I can get an old mule and a piece of an old plow. One of the boys look at pappy and say, I like take yo head for a target, but the old man with them say no, so they leave my pappy alone. They have the commissary where the folks get food. It belonged to the Yankee soldiers. Food scarce like everything. Folks say now they have hard times. They don't know nothing about hard times lest they live in wartime and be slave to white folks. Then they was the Ku Klux Klan. They wore frightful-looking critters. My pappy say they go out into the country and tie poor niggers to the tree and beat them to death. They dress all kinds of fashions. Most of them look like ghosts. They never go like the patty rollers. They just sneak round at night when the poor niggers in bed. Then about 12 o'clock they tie up all the niggers they catch, and after they through beating them, they leaves them with they hands tied in the air and the blood a streaming outen they backs. Atter freedom, I come here to live with my folks, the Williamses. That's how I come to be Williams. Never had no children of my own. They calls me Elizabeth Johnson, for I went to live with the Mixons. Then I be one of the Mixon niggers. Then later I be a Williams. Don't guess names matter much. No way. End of section 81. Section 82 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Penny Williams, Ex-Slave Story. An interview with Penny Williams, 76, of 716 Southeast Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I was born at the Hinton Place, about 3 miles south of Raleigh, and course we longed to Mr. Lawrence Hinton. My mammy was named Harriet Moore, and my pappy was named Mac Moore. Dat was 'cause dey longed first to a Mr. Moore, I specs. I had 10 brothers and sisters, and we all done putty good. The marster owned around 200 slaves and about 400 acres of land, and they had to work pert, they says. We had enough to eat, sich as it was, but dat ain't bragging, I reckons, and we was punished pretty bad if'n we complains, sasses or fuses to work like we should. Nat Whitaker was the overseer and pateroller, and he was strict, I's tellin' you. I seed him beat slaves till the blood run. Dar was some nigger mens what'd go coodin' spite of the devil, and as the marster ain't gibben dem no passes, they goes without 'em. Mr. Whitaker, he whoops and whoops, but dat ain't stop 'em. At last, Marster Lawrence sides to hang cowbells on their necks so's he can hear dem if'n dey leaves the place at a night. I's tellin' you, child, dem niggers am gwine anyway. They ain't got sense 'nough to put their hands in the bell to keep the clapper from ringing, but they does stuff the bell with leaves, and it don't ring none. Sides that, they tears their shirts or steals sheets from Mrs. Clothesline and fold dem to make a scarf. They ties these round their necks to hide the bell and goes on a courtin'. They ain't got no pins to pin the scarf on, but they uses thorns from the locust tree or the crab apple, and they holds fine. They warn't no spoons, knives, and forks them days, but the smart slave cut him some outen hickory, and they was just as good as the other kind. They also ain't got no matches them days, so flint rocks was rubbed together. I members mostly about the rear end of the war, especially about the Yankees comin'. I members that Marster and his family done moved to town, 'cause they can't get no 'tection there. There wasn't a soul on the place but the slaves there when the Yankees come to takin' and a killin'. I members that I was drawin' water at the well when the Yankees comed. I looks up the road and dar am a gang of 'em comin'. I draps the bucket back in the well and I flies in the big house. Well, sir, they kills the chickens, hogs, geese, and everything as they comes, even to Marster's collie, and when they gets to the big house they swears that they'll burn it down. They stands there for a minute, and then one of 'em says that hit am too putty to burn. Another one says that hit am too putty to belong to a damn reb, but they don't burn it. I hears hit all from the window in the big house, and I sure is glad that they ain't burn hit. They tears up all they wants to, then they robs the smokehouse, and they goes on 'bout their business. Arter the surrender, our white folkses comes back, and we stays on 5 or 6 years, I reckon. Then we moves to Miss Emma Green's place 5 miles further in the country. We sure ain't got long good arter the war. The Yankees would die to free us, ain't carin' if'n we starves nother. Suddenly Aunt Penny was attracted by a hummingbird flitting around the pomegranate bush near the doorstep. Do you know which am the best way to catch a hummingbird, child? After a negative answer, she smiled. When you sees him round the flowers, then you soaks 2 or 3 in whiskey. They bird will suck till he gets drunk and can't fly away. That's how you catch him. I hates the town spars and the cowbirds what ain't got enough sense to leave the floods. You read 'bout hit in the papers, I reckon. You knows they am 'bout the size of a peckerwood. Yes'm, one which tried to ride me once. I was into bed, and she thought that I was asleep. I feels her when she crawls up on my left leg and stops the circulation. I knows how to fix her dough, so I gets up and puts a knife under my pillow. I has slept with that knife there ever since that time, and I ain't had no mo' trouble with witches nor circulation nother. So I reckons that I fixed her good and plenty. End of section 82.
Section 83 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Patterson of Monmouth County, New Jersey. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2, Section 83. Aunt Plaz. An interview with Plaz Williams of Four Oaks, who says she is around 90 years of age. Margaret Thornton says that she has got the world record beat on nursing, but that's where she's wrong. She ain't a day over 70. Yes, she says that she has nursed more than I has, and me 90. Right now, I's a nursing of a woman what has just got back from the hospital. Yes, ma'am. A heap of people says that they'd rather have me than the doctor. I was born in Mississippi, so they tells me. Then I was sold to Mr. Moses Mordecai of Raleigh. After that, I longed to a Mr. Henry Lane who lived in Wake County. There was 2 or 3 of them Lanes named Henry, 'cause this one was the youngest. I worked in the fields like a man, and I liked it too. Massa Moses had overseers what beat you for nothing, but Massa Henry ain't that sort of person at all. Massa Moses and Massa Henry both drunk whiskey and such, but they was different when they was drunk. Massa Moses'll beat you and cuss you, but Massa Henry'll laugh at you and play with you. I know one time Massa Moses come to see Massa Henry, and after they had drunk a while, Massa Henry see me in the yard. It being on Sunday, he calls me to come to his library. When I gets in, he asks me if and I's ever been drunk, and I tells him no. Then he pours me a glass full and says for me to drink it. I begs at first. Then I says that I won't drink the brandy. Massa Henry laughed and would have let me go, but that devil Massa Moses says, "Let's hold her down and pour it down a guzzle, Henry." That's what they done, and they pours down several drinks. Directly Massa Henry asks me to fetch him some water, but when I starts my legs, I'm too weak to go, so I sits down on the floor. Massa Henry laugh and laugh, but Massa Moses says, "Whoop the shameless hussy what ain't got no more reason than to get dog drunk." He would have whooped me too, but Massa Henry wouldn't let him do it. Instead of beating me, he says to get in the corner and sleep it off. I don't know nothing about the Yankees common, 'cause we was sent way back in the country to stay. Massa Henry come out there and tells us that we is free. Massa Henry has told Jack Williams that he can't have me for this. So I asked, "Can I marry Jack now, Massa Henry?" He says yes. So fortnight, I is at Jack's cabin. I thought that there ain't got to be no preacher, but a week or two after this, a preacher comes by and marries us. We moved here 'cause it ain't better farming land. We worked hard to make anything do, and for a while I thought that we'd starve to death. There ain't so much to tell about after the war. Our childrens died fast as we had 'em. We worked hard, and about 20 years ago, Jack died. I's been on charity some, but I hope that when I gets my pension, I won't have to trouble them no more. End of section 83. Section 84 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Patterson of Monmouth County, New Jersey. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Section 84. Melissa Williamson, Ex-Slave Story. An interview with Melissa Williamson, 77 of Bledsoe Avenue, Raleigh, North Carolina. This June 15th, 78 years ago, I was born in Franklin County near Lewisburg. My mammy and me belonged to Mr. Billy Mitchell 'fore she died, which was one of the first things that I members. And then Miss Mitchell took me in her house and raised me. That was the first year of the war, I believes. The Mitchells was good to us in a way, and they don't spare the rod when it am needed. Nor does they think that a pickaninny can't go barefooted in the hot summertime. They believes in a heap of work, though, and no play at all, and very little rations. The men slaves would work in the fields, and at dinner time they ain't had nothing except a quart of buttermilk and an ash cake. I got a whole heap better than they did, but youngin' like I begged them for some of their dinner. I never thought that Miss Mitchell was hard till I see her whip Aunt Padea. Aunt Padea was a good soul, and she was good to we youngins, and we loved her. She got to getting frantic, though, and she put on her dinner on the stove. Then she go to the woods and run a romp like a child. Miss Mitchell had loved her, too. But after a while, she got mad, and she was mad bad, too. She took Aunt Padea out to a tree, stripped off her waist, tied her to the tree, and whooped her with a cowhide till the blood runs down her back. We was told that the Yankees would kill us, and we was scared of them, too, and I was always running for fear the Yankees would get me. When they did come, I was out at the well, drawing water with the windlass, and I was so short that I had to jump up to grab the handle. I looked up the road, and the Yankees was coming up the road as thick as fleas on a dog's back. I gives a yell, turned the windlass loose, and flies round the house to my missus. It's a wonder that windlass ain't turned over and break my head in. I had heard about my sister what was so 'fore I was born, and I ain't know where she is, but after the war had been over for 2 years, she come to Miss Mitchell's and got me. She carried me to Lewisburg and sent me to the Yankee school there. I remember a song that the Yankees teached us, or at least a part of one.
How often we think of childhood joys and tricks we used to play upon each other while at school to while the time away. They often wished me with them, but they always wished in vain. I'd rather be with Rosnell, a-swingin' in the lane. I won't talk to my chillins about slavery days, 'cause I don't want 'em to get stirred up about it. I's told 'em that we ain't paid no more than the white folkses for our freedom. 'Cause some of them sold the reservoirs to get here, and they fought in wars that the nigger don't know nothing 'bout. I know that Miss Mitchell done wrong when she ain't give us enough to eat, and when she whooped Aunt Padea about being crazy. But I remember something else that makes me tender toward her and other white folkses. I remembers that Miss Mitchell used to take me visitin' to white folks' house, and some of them hate niggers and won't give me no place to sleep, 'cept on the floor by Mrs. bed. Sometimes I can feel her now, covering me up with her own clothes during the night, or feeling me to see if I'm chilly or too hot. End of section 84.
Section number 85 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Alex Woods. Ex-Slave Story. 8 Ford Alley, end of Martin Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. My name is Alex Woods. I was born May 15, 1858. In slavery time, I belonged to Jim Woods of Orange County. The plantation was between Durham and Hillsborough, near the edge of Granville County. My missus' name was Polly Woods. They treated us tolerable fare to a fellow. Our food was well cooked. We were fed from the kitchen of the great house. We called Master's house the great house in them times. We called the porch the piazza. We were fed from the kitchen of his house during the week. We cooked and we ate at our homes Saturday nights and Sundays. We wove our clothes. Children had only one piece, a long shirt. We went barefooted, and in our shirt tails, we youngins did. We did not have any shoes, winter nor summer, but Mother and Father had shoes with wooden bottoms and leather tops. Dr. Tupper, the man who was principal of the Shaw School, the man who started the school in the church on Blanche Street, gave me my first pair of shoes. This was the second year after the surrender. I was 9 years old then. They were boots with wide brass on the toes, solid leather shoes made in Raleigh on Fayetteville Street in the basement of Tucker's dry goods store, above the Masonic Temple as you go up. Old man Jim Jones, a colored shoemaker, worked in this shop. I can read, but I cannot write, 'cause I've been run over 3 times by automobiles. Once my buggy was torn to pieces and I was knocked high in the air. The first time they run into me, they killed my horse. The third time, they paralyzed my arm and busted the lining of my stomach. I learned to read and write since the surrender by studying in spare time. They wouldn't let any slaves have books in slavery time. Mother had a book she kept hid. They would whoop a slave if they caught him with a book. There were between 25 and 30 slaves on the plantation, but there was no church. They would not allow us to have prayer meetings in our houses, but we would gather late in the night and turn pots upside down inside the door to kill the sound and sing and pray for freedom. No one could hear unless they eavesdropped. The patroller rode around to see after the slaves and whipped them when they caught them away from home. I have seen slaves whipped. They took them into the barn and corn crib and whipped them with a leather strap called the cat o' nine tails. They'd hit them 99 licks sometimes. They wouldn't allow 'em to call on the Lord when they were whipping 'em, and they'd let 'em say, oh, pray, master, they would say. Are you going to work? Are you going visiting without a pass? Are you going to run away? These are the things they would ask him when they was whooping him. My old master's brother John was a slave speculator. I remember seeing him bringing slaves in chains to the plantation when he was carrying them to Richmond to put them on the auction block to be sold. They were handcuffed with a small chain to a large chain between them, 2 men side by side. There was about 30 in a drove. There was about 3 or 4 white men on horses. They was called slave drivers. Some went before and some behind. They carried pistols on their sides. The distance was so far they camped out at night. The slaves sat by the fire and slept on these trips with the chains on them. Every time the men's come to our house, I was afraid my mother and father would be sold away from me. If a woman was a good breeder, she sold high, sometimes bringing $500 to $1,000. The men who was doing the buying would inspect them. They would look at their mouths and look 'em over just like buying horses. There were no jails on the plantation. Sometimes we went to the white folks' church. The preacher would tell us to obey our missus and master. That's what the preacher told us. They would take us back home and give us plenty to eat after preaching was over and tell us to do what the preacher said. They tasked us Saturday mornings, and if we got it done, we could go to the branch on a flat rock and wash our clothes. They allowed my father to hunt with a gun. He was a good hunter, and he brought a lot of game to the plantation. They cooked it at the great house and divided it up. My father killed deer and turkey. All had plenty rabbits, possums, coons, and squirrels. My father's first wife was sold from him, and I am the child of the second wife. I had 5 brothers, Green, Isom, Nupez, then Sam Woods, who was no slave, then Spencer Woods, who was no slave. I had 5 sisters, Molly, Rosella, who were slaves, and Nancy, Catherine, and Fanny, who were not slaves. My father was named Major Woods, and mother was named Betty Woods. Yes, sir, I remember getting sick before the surrender, and they bled me and gave me blue mass pills. They wouldn't tell me what was the matter. Mrs. chewed our food for us when we was small. The babies were fed with sugar tits, and the food Mrs. chewed. Their suckled mothers suckled them at dinner, and then stayed in the field till night. I remember Mrs. chewing for me, and the first whipping I got. Mrs. whipped me for pushing my sister in the fire. Sister called me a lie, and I pushed her in the fire and burned her hand. Mrs. whipped me. We never did fight nor push one another after that. Master used colored overseers when he did not work his men himself. I was very much afraid of the Ku Klux. They wore masks, and they could make you think they could drink a whole bucket of water and walk without noise like a ghost. Colored folks was afraid of them. They was the fear of the niggers. I married Addie Shaw in 1888 first. Then in 1918 I married again. I think Abraham Lincoln was all right. He caused us to be free. Franklin D. Roosevelt is all right. He kept a lot of people from perishing to death. End of section number 85. Read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, August the 17th, 2021.
Section 86 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Patterson of Monmouth County, New Jersey. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Section 86, Anna Wright. An interview with Anna Wright, 72 years of age, of Wendell, North Carolina. I was born the year the war ended, so I can't tell nothing that I see, only what my mammy told me. We lived there on Massa James Ellis's plantation till I was about 5 or 6 years old. So I remembers the slave cabins and the big house. The plantation was in Scotland County, and the big house sat on a little knoll. Back of the big house sat the rows of slave cabins, and back of them was the apple orchard and the bee orchard. It was a purty place sure enough, and they tells me that they was happy for the war, 'cause Massa James was good to them. There must have been about 200 slaves, according to the number of cabins. The slaves worked hard in the fields, but unless the work was pushing, they had Saturday evening off to go a-fishing or to do anything they wanted to do. 2 or 3 times a year, Massa James let 'em have a dance and invite all the neighborhood slaves. They had corn shuckings every fall, and the other slaves would come to them. The candy pullings was a big affair with the niggers. They come from all over the neighborhood to cook their molasses and pull the candy. While the candy cooled, they played draping the handkerchief and a heap of other games. The courting couples liked these games 'cause they could set out or play and court all they pleased. They often made up their minds to ask the master if they could marry too at these parties. The weddings was something fine, believe me. The niggers dressed like a white folks' wedding, and the circuit parson married them in the big house parlor. The master and the missus was there, and they'd always give presents to the bride too. After the ceremony was over, there'd be a feast and a dance. Most likely, there'd be a heap of noise. I've heard Mommy tell of several big weddings. Mama told me that Massa James was a very religious man, and that was why the preacher married the slaves, and why he made all the slaves go to church on Sunday and say the blessing at meal times. My pappy was named Tom, and he worked in the fields for Massa James. It was pappy that hauled up the watermelons in the wagon body after I could remember, and they said that he hauled them up in slavery times too. Massa James raised a plenty melons for all the slaves, and he raised plenty of hogs to eat the rinds. The slaves used to have a watermelon slicing about once a week, and sometimes they'd invite neighbors in. You wants to know about some old slavery foods? Well, I tell you what I knows. Did you ever hear of Kush? Kush was cornbread, cooked in the big griddle on the fireplace, mashed up with raw onions and ham gravy poured over it. You might think that it ain't good, but it am. Fried chicken was seasoned, draped in flour, and then simmered in a big pan of ham gravy with a lid on it till it was tender. Then the lid was took off, and the chicken was fried a golden brown as quick as possible. Does you know the old Southern way of making baked chicken dressing? Well, it was made from soft cornbread with bacon grease, onions, black pepper, and boiled eggs. Some of the folks used cheese, too, in the dressing. The griddle cakes was flour and meal mixed, put on a big old iron griddle on the fireplace and flipped over 2 times. Ash cake was made of either meal or flour, wrapped in a damp cloth and cooked in the hot ashes on the hearth. Taters was cooked in the ashes, too, and they was good like that. I's heard Mammy say that the slave childrens used to bake onions that way. Fish them days was dipped in meal 'fore they was cooked, 'cept catfish, and they was stewed with onions. Cornmeal dumplings was boiled in the turnip greens, collards, cabbages, and so on, even the snap beans. And at supper, the pot liquor was eat with the dumplings. That's why the folks was so healthy. Speaking 'bout sweets, the blackberry or other kind of pie was cooked in a big pan with 2 crusts. That made more and was better to boot. Cakes was mostly plain or had jelly filling, 'cept for special company. From the first I could remember, the white folks and niggers alike ain't had much to eat. A heap of our rations was vegetables, squirrels, rabbits, possums, and coons. We drunk parched meal water for coffee, and we done without a heap of things. But after a while we got richer, and Massa James got some money for something from the north, so they got along all right. When I was 12, we moved to Wake County, out near Wendell, and when I was 13, I married Sam Wright, and we got along fine till he dies about 10 years ago. We ain't had but 3 childrens, but we lived through a heap of bad depressions. What we needs mostly am law and justice. Why, it was better when the Ku Kluxes had law, they tells me. Nowadays, the nigger fights on the streets like dogs. Back then, the boss man see to it that there was law and order in the town and in the country, too, for that matter. And them was the good old days. End of section 86.
Section number 87 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Dilly Yellady, 909 Mark Street. Yes, sir, I remembers about what my mammy told me about Abraham Lincoln, Grant, and a lot of them Yankees coming down here for the surrender. From what they told me, Sherman knowed the South like a book 'fore he came through last time. That he did. Yankees come through dressed like tramps, and they was always looking for some of their people. That was their excuse. They was at big shindigs of Southern white folks had before the war. Mammy and Dad, they said the niggers would get into slave quarters at night and pray for freedom and laugh about what the Yankees was doing, about Lincoln and Grant fooling their masters so. Old Jeff Davis said he was going to fight the Yankees till hell was so full of them that their legs was hanging over the sides. But when they got him in a close place, he was dressing woman's clothes and tried to get away from 'em. But they seen his boots when he started to get in that thing they rode in then, a carriage. Yes, that's what it was, a carriage. They seen his boots and knowed who it was. They just laughed and pointed at him and said, "You hold on there, we got you. We knows who you is," and they then took him. He was mighty brave till they got him in a close place, then he quit barking so loud. Mammy and Dad, they said there was a lot of the white folks didn't care much about Jeff Davis. They said he was just the braggingest man in the world, always a-blowing. That bird flew mighty high, but he had to come back to the ground, and of course, when he hit, the Yankees was waiting for him and catched him. I was born May 2nd, 2 years after the surrender. I is 70 years old. My mammy belonged to Otzi Poole. When he died, she fell to his son, Billy Poole. There was 6 of the children, and they was given out to the Poole children. They went like land does now. They went to their heirs. Old man Osty loved liquor so good he would steal it from himself. He'd take a drink and then blow his breath and keep wife from smelling it. My uncle, Parker Poole, told me the Yankees made a slave of him. His master was so good to him, he was as happy as he could be before the Yankees come. I was born on the Harper Whitaker place near Swift Creek. Simon Yellady was my father. He was born in Mississippi, and he belonged to Dr. Yellady. My father and his brothers run away and went to the Yankees. I heard Daddy tell about it. He got sick, and they shipped him back home to North Carolina. They shifted niggers from place to place to keep the Yankees from taking them. When there got to be too many Yankees in a place, the slaves were sent out to keep them from being set free. Mother said once when she was carrying the cows to the pasture, they looked down the railroad and everything was blue. A nigger girl by the name of Susan was with her. My mother was named Relia Poole. They said they just fell down and the Yankees commenced saying, "Hello, Dinah. Hello, Susie." Mother and Susan ran. They just went flying. When they crossed the creek, my mother lost her shoe in the mud, but she just kept running. When she got home, she told her missus the Yankees were riding up the railroad just as thick as flies. Then my great-grandmother said, "Well, I has been praying long enough for 'em. Now day is here." My great-grandmother was named Nancy Poole, and she was not afraid of nothing. I was a little teensy thing when she died. My mother told we all about them times they rode the horses up to the smokehouse and got the meat. The Yankees went to the clothesline and got the clothes and filled the legs and arms with corn and slung it over their saddles and rode away. Yes, the Yankees freed us, but they left nothing for us to live on. They give us freedom, but they took most everything and left us nothing to eat, nothing to live on. We lived in Wake County all the time. I did not get only to the 3rd grade in school. Sister Mary Elisa got to the 2nd grade. Father could write a little, Mother couldn't. Couldn't go to school except when it was too wet to work. Work, work, work. 30 acres in cotton and corn plowed till the 15th of August. Plow, plow, plow hard ground, bad ground. 9 girls and 1 boy working from sun to sun. My mother had 23 children. She was just as smart as she could be. Worked in the field till just a while before she died. She been dead about 20 years. My father been dead about 10 years. He died right here in Raleigh with me at 121 Corner Mark at Bledsoe Street. I've had a hard time working all my life. I ain't able to work now, but I does all I can. I have places to work a little every day for my white folks. I'm going to work long as I can. My mother and father said they had good masters, and they were crazy about 'em. Sometimes they sold slaves, and then the patrollers whooped 'em now and then, but they had nothing to say against their white folks. Well, I lost my home. I have worked most of my life since I've come to Raleigh, buying a home, but I got old and couldn't keep up the payments, and they come down here and took my home. That's the worst thing that's come to me in my whole life. Unless you tried it, you can't imagine how bad it makes you feel to have to give up your home. End of section number 87, read by Kevin Waters, Spring Hill, Florida, October the 11th, 2021. Section number 88 of Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kevin Waters. Slave Narratives, Volume 11, North Carolina, Part 2. Hilliard Yellerday, 1112 Oakwood Avenue, Raleigh, North Carolina. My mother and father told me many interesting stories of slavery and of its joys and sorrows. From what they told me, there was two sides to the picture. One was extremely bad, and the other was good. These features of slavery were also dependent on the phases of human attitude and temperament, which also was good or bad. If the master was broad-minded, with the love in his heart for his fellow man, his slaves were at no disadvantage because of their low social standing and their lack of a voice in the civil affairs of the community, state, and nation. On the other hand, if the master was narrow-minded, overbearing, and cruel, the case was reversed, and the situation the slaves were placed in caused a condition to exist concerning their general welfare that was bad, and the slave was as low socially as the swine or other animals on the plantation. Some owners gave their slaves the same kind of food served on their own tables and allowed the slaves the same privileges enjoyed by their own children. Other masters fed their slave children from troughs made very much like those from which the hogs of the plantation were fed. There were many instances where they were given water in which the crumbs and refuse from the master's table had been placed. They gathered around this food with gourds and mussel shells from the freshwater creeks and ate from this trough. Such a condition was very bad indeed. My mother was named Maggie Yellerday, and my father was named Sam Yellerday. They belonged to Dr. Jonathan Yellerday, who owned a large plantation and over 100 slaves. His plantation looked like a small town. He had blacksmith shops, shoe shops, looms for weaving cloth, a corn mill, and a liquor distillery. There was a tanyard covering more than 1/4 of an acre where he tanned the hides of animals to use in making shoes. There was a large bell they used to wake the slaves in the morning and to call them to their meals during the day. He had carriages and horses, stable men and carriage men. The carriage master and his family rode in was called a coach by the slaves on the plantation. His house had 18 rooms, a large hall, and 4 large porches. The house sat in a large grove about 1 mile square, and the slave quarters were arranged in rows at the back of master's great house. The nearest cabins were about 100 yards from it. Dr. Jonathan Yellerday looked after slaves' health, and the food was fair, but the slaves were worked by overseers who made it hard for them, as he allowed them to whip a slave at will. He had so many slaves he did not know all their names. His fortune was his slaves. He did not sell slaves, and he did not buy many. The last 10 years preceding the war, he resorted to raising his own slaves. When a girl became a woman, she was required to go to a man and become a mother. There was generally a form of marriage. The master read a paper to them telling them that they were man and wife. Some were married by the master laying down a broom, and the two slaves, man and woman, would jump over it. The master would then tell them they were man and wife, and they could go to bed together. Master would sometimes go and get a large, hale, hearty Negro man from some other plantation to go to his Negro woman. He would ask the other master to let this man come over to his place to go to his slave girls. A slave girl was expected to have children as soon as she became a woman. Some of them had children at the age of 12 and 13 years old. Negro men 6 feet tall went to some of these children. Mother said there were cases where these young girls loved someone else and would have to receive the attentions of men of their master's choice. This was a general custom. This state of affairs tended to loosen the morals of the Negro race, and they have never fully recovered from its effect. Some slave women would have dozens of men during their life. Negro women who had had a half-dozen mock husbands in slavery time were plentiful. The holy bonds of matrimony did not mean much to a slave. The masters called themselves Christians, went to church worship regularly, and yet allowed this condition to exist. Mother, father, sister, and I were sent as refugees from Mississippi to North Carolina. They were afraid the Yankees would get to us in Mississippi. I was only 4 years old when the war ended, as I was born April the 6th, 1861, so I do not remember the trip. We were sent to Warren County to the Brownlows plantation, where we stayed until the war ended. There was a question as to just what Mississippi would do, and then Mother said the doctor feared we would be taken by the Yankees there, so he sent us to North Carolina to the above-named county. Mother was sent to stay with Mrs. Green Parrish, and she took me with her. Mr. Green Parrish was gone to the war. In the last of the war, he was wounded and sent home. While he was recovering, I fanned the flies off him. That's the first thing I remember about the war. When he got well, he went back, and then the war soon ended. After the war ended, Father and the family moved to Halifax County and worked on a farm belonging to Mr. Sterling Johnston. I was in Warren County when I first began to remember anything, and I do not have any specific remembrance of the Yankees. We stayed in Halifax County 18 years, going from one plantation to another, but we made no money. The landlords got all we made except what we ate in war. They would always tell us we ate ours up. Sometimes we would be almost naked, barefooted and hungry when the crop was housed, and then the landlord would make us leave. We would go to another with about the same results. There was a story going that each slave would get 40 acres of land and a mule at the end of the war. The Yankees started this story, but the mule and the land was never given, and slaves were turned out without anything and with nowhere to go. We moved to Wake County, and I farmed until 1903. I had not gotten $100 a head in all this time, so I got a job with the railroad, SAL, shops in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that is the only place I ever made any money. Father died in 1900 and Mother in 1923. I worked from 1903 until 1920 with the SAL Railroad as flunky. I worked as box packer and machinist helper. Mother and Father died without ever owning a house, but I saved my money while working for the railroad company and bought this lot, 157 by 52 and a half, and had this house built on it. The house has 5 rooms and cost about $1,000. I've been so of late years I could not pay my taxes. I am partially blind and unable to work anymore. End of section number 88. End of Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States from interviews with former slaves. Volume 11, North Carolina Narratives, Part 2, by Various.